Our interview today is with Mr. Will Erwin. Mr. Erwin is a lifelong farmer in Marshall and Kosciuszko counties in northern Indiana. He has held many public offices, including Indiana State Senator, Assistant Secretary of Agriculture for Rural Development, Special Advisor to the Administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and a member of the Farm Credit Assistance System Board of Directors. He received a Bachelor of Science degree in Agriculture from the University of Illinois and recently received an Honorary Doctor of Agriculture degree from Purdue University. Mr. Erwin, I'd like to begin the interview today by asking you to give us a brief background about your farming operation and how it has changed since you began farming.
Well, I guess you'd say that initially the overwhelming activity was to have the very best technology, that you worked to develop the best fertilizer system, the best hybrid varieties and this sort of thing. But very shortly that began to change, and the dimension of systems and what kind of systems you use, and then the injection of the environment, so that the technology is still very important, but now it's broader. It includes a lot more than just technology.
Would you tell us a little bit about how you have been associated with Purdue University, and in particular how that may have influenced your farming operation or your public activities?
Well, the first contact came when we were just out of the University of Illinois, and June was invited to go to an extension meeting, and she came back just euphoric. She'd heard these two wonderful people called Bottom and Kohlmeyer. And thereafter, it was just mandated that anytime there was an extension policy meeting that I attend. As time went on, I found Purdue a very useful resource. When we had problems, we would call up, frequently drive down there. Frequently, June and myself and other people who were involved in our farm would drive down and have discussions. Then I was one of the founding members of the Purdue Farm Policy Study Group. I was chairman of the local extension committee. And I've been on a number of dean's advisory committees, and I've been very much a beneficiary of Purdue.
I know, Mr. Erwin, that you've been a long-time steward of the land and concerned about proper care of your farmland here in Marshall and Kosciuszko counties. I wonder if you'd share with us a little bit how you have modified or changed your farming practices over the years in order to operate in a more environmentally friendly fashion.
Well, early on, I think in perhaps the very first year that I farmed, it was apparent to me that our predecessors had, of course, originally converted the land from wilderness to productive farmland. And then they had become concerned and were very creative in conservation. And it was apparent to me that with the technology we had, we really could live in the age of soil improvement. It wasn't enough to conserve. We ought to really try to make it better. And one of the early innovations that I tried was, when we still used the moldboard plow, was plow plant, where we just turned it over, and then I invented a weird-looking tractor that I modified to just pull on the freshly plowed ground and plant it. I remember a fellow came to me and said, "Well, Will, you're not going to cultivate very much. How are you going to loosen that ground back up?" And I said, "If you don't pack it down, you don't have to loosen it up." And this gave us a substantial improvement in soil tilth and some improvement of yield. Then we went into other processes of less tillage and began to use pesticides, but always on a rather cautious basis. We used band spray instead of broadcast. Always felt that they were a useful tool, but you didn't want to use them unless you absolutely had to, and then not use any more than you had to. And we have, for I don't know how many years, operated on a basis that we didn't use a pesticide at more than 50% of the rate that was indicated on the label, just because we wanted that kind of margin in there. Also, many years ago, we began to look at the land in terms of not only its productivity from the standpoint of producing crops, but its highest and best use in terms of sociology. and quality of life. We had a pasture field across from the house here, and then back in 1960 or 61, I kind of thought maybe it would have a higher utility if it was made into a small lake. And we did that, and it proved to be very successful, not economically particularly, but in terms of richness of life. Our whole family learned to swim down there. My wife taught swimming, and then our daughter taught swimming, and then I don't know how many other people taught swimming. And for a period of about 30 years, lessons were given there every summer. I don't know how many thousands of kids have gotten Red Cross water safety certificates out of it. But it was just a case where a piece of real estate had more utility for other purposes than farming. Now, of course, the age has moved on and those lessons are all being taught in swimming pools because there are other places for kids to swim. But during that period of time, the land had another utility.
Well, because of your concerns about the land and your activities on your own farm, you had a wonderful opportunity a few years ago to be a special advisor to the administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Tell us a little bit about what your role was and how you were selected to have this opportunity to serve our nation.
Well, it was one of those fun surprises. I had served in the Indiana legislature with Bill Ruckelshaus, and Bill became the head of the brand new Environmental Protection Agency, and the phone rang one day and he said, "Will, I need you to come down here." And I said, "What on earth do you want with a farmer?" And I remember his answer very vividly. He said, "I have distinguished PhDs on both sides of the pesticide issue, and they sometimes get so mad that they won't talk to each other, and I need somebody with some practical experience to come down here and give me some counsel." So I went down there, and it was one of the really fun experiences of my life because Ruckelshaus had surrounded himself with a bunch of very bright young people. I was sort of the oldster of the group. And they were all committed to improving the environment. And when you start a new agency, it's kind of a shambles because everybody just shifts everything into it and it has to be organized. But everybody was committed to one absolute objective, and that was to set up a good agency to help with the environment. And it was really a fun experience, and it was also a learning experience. And it was there that I learned that if you're going to be effective, that you have to be part of a team who's trying to do a job. And in the discussions, I would advocate an agricultural point of view really hard. Sometimes I'd prevail, sometimes I wouldn't. And when I didn't prevail, I would find myself later facing an agricultural group, sometimes good friends of mine, who were giving me the arguments I had used and not prevailed on, and kind of giving me what for about it. And I would be defending the EPA position because that was the final position. Now, if it's a moral issue, you resign. But if it's a judgment issue, then you win some, you lose some, and you have to be a loyal team player. I think it's important to remember that if you're going to be part of a team, you have to do that. Because when you do that, you develop a credibility within the team. And then your real effectiveness comes when people within the agency consider you to be a member of that team, and then they call you early on, when the issue is just being formed, and ask for your input. And your real creativity then comes from your participation in the early stages before a group become committed to a position and then feel they need to fight for it, when they're still forming their thinking. But in order to do that, you have to be a part of that organization. And sometimes it's darned uncomfortable when your colleagues are giving you what for.
What if we could look ahead a little bit at some of the issues that we're going to be facing in the years ahead with respect to the environment, and some of the concerns and issues that farmers in particular will be facing in the years ahead?
Well, here I get a little philosophical. If you look at the environmental movement, it really had its roots with farmers. Back in the 30s, when we had the concern about soil conservation and water quality and really environmental enhancement. And this picked up a good bit of cultural acceptance. In recent decades, we have developed a kind of a polarization between, quote, environmentalists and, quote, farmers or agriculturalists. And I think this polarization is unfortunate. I don't know a farmer who isn't at heart an environmentalist. And I don't know an environmentalist who doesn't recognize the reality that the farmers are the fundamental custodians of the surface of the earth, and therefore if they want to achieve their objectives, they're pretty dependent on farmers. What happened was that some environmental extremists took rather extreme positions. Then some agricultural extremists took extreme positions and created a polarization, which I think is not that creative. There's no farmer who wants to poison his soil or create something in the well that's going to hurt his children and his grandchildren and so on, and it's a little presumptuous on the part of some other group to say that they have to protect a farmer's grandchildren from their grandfather or something like that. And I don't think they mean to do that. I think they simply find some statistical data that indicates something's not being done and they want to do something to protect. I think the first real issue of the environment is whether thinking, responsible, thoughtful farmers and thoughtful environmentalists are going to say there's so much more to be gained by working together toward our common objectivities, than our objectives, not objectivities. Maybe that was a Freudian slip. Work together toward our common objectives rather than polarizing and dragging things out in resistance back and forth. I think when that occurs, there are going to be tremendous fringe benefits to both farmers and environmentalists. Case in point, I think the culture now is pretty much concerned about what they call income transfers to farmers. Now, I personally don't believe it quite works out that way, but that's what the culture perceives. I think it's unlikely that in periods of agricultural pressure that there'll be the kind of government programs and the kind of fundings that we've had in the past. On the other hand, I think the culture is really attuned to environmental enhancement. And I think programs that take highly erodible land and put it to trees and other conservation or environmental purposes have a very good chance of evolving and becoming enhanced. While I think programs that simply pay farmers cash for doing or not doing something have a somewhat limited future. I think that's an example of where environmentalists can work with farmers and achieve farm policy goals as well as environmental goals.
I understand that you and your wife have recently had the opportunity to visit Brazil, and particularly the Amazon region. And I wonder if you could share with us a little bit about what you experienced there, and in particular, your thoughts on the economic and agricultural development of that part of the world, and what we might do in the environmental area. It's been of importance to many people. We just had a special Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro to focus particularly on that part of the world. What were your observations?
Well, first of all, I don't want to come across as an instant expert. I will give you my observations. First of all, in the issue of the rainforest, and particularly the Amazon basin, it may be typical of environmental response, where one group says it's no problem and the other group says it's a horrible problem and it's all going to be destroyed. In talking with the experts that I talked with, they indicated that of the remaining rainforests in the Amazon, that a great deal of it will never be destroyed because part of the year it's under 20 or 30 feet of water and nobody's going to go in there and try to farm it and so on. So that perhaps the summary is that there is a real basis for concern. But those people who say the whole rainforest is going to be destroyed are also inaccurate. The fundamental problem there is, as is often the case, not just an environmental problem, it's a sociological problem. You have poor people who want to support their family, and they can go into that rainforest and for a few years eke out a better existence than they could if they stayed where they did. So I think the solution is to have alternative opportunities for those people who are going in and doing this, and I rather doubt if until you have the alternatives, the more positive alternatives, that we're going to do much to stop the ongoing destruction.
One of the things that's happened over the years, partly because of technology, partly because of finances, partly because of the ups and downs of the marketplace, is that we've had structural change in American agriculture and in Indiana agriculture. It's been very dramatic in your lifetime and mine both. Just a few statistics to set the stage for a question or two I'd like to ask you. First of all, the average farm size has more than doubled in the United States since the Second World War. We only have about 1/3 as many people living in rural communities and rural areas today as was true 50 years ago. And of the roughly 2 million farms that we have in the United States today, about 15% of them produce about 3/4 of the total output. And in fact, here in Marshall and Kosciuszko County where you farm, we're in the area where many Amish farmers live and raise their families, and they use technologies of our fathers and grandfathers, and they've been able to make that system work reasonably well for them for a variety of reasons. So in a sense, you can see here today in the county the modern agriculture and the structural change, and yet some of the agriculture of the past. My questions for you are, first, how do you see the structure of agriculture changing in the decade of the 90s? And secondly, do you think that we should have any policy action at the federal or state or perhaps local level that might influence the number of farms or size of farms or how farmers operate?
Well, I'm not sure I can foresee what the structural changes are going to be. The Amish that you mentioned will continue. They live very frugally. It's their religious value system to live that way. Therefore, their living costs and their operating costs are very low. They rode out the agricultural depression better than the rest of us. They didn't have the technology demands and the leverage that the rest of us encountered. In terms of the other structure, I rather suspect that the farm families of the future will probably rent a little more land and be less concerned with owning it for a number of reasons. One is that I'm not sure they're going to want to take the reduction in lifestyle that you have to take if every bit of money that you can earn has to go to pay the payments on the additional piece of land. This is a pretty good debate. There are a lot of farmers who have accumulated in their life, but when you look at what they sacrifice to do that, it's understandable why the next generation might not want to do that. And this may also permit people to balance, investors to balance their portfolio and own farmland and be comfortable with it because it is operated and essentially managed by very responsible farmers, particularly younger farmers who are coming on. So there'll be some shift in that direction. The whole new generation of farmers and their use of computers, I think will increase the emphasis on systems as compared to technology or the amount of time that is put into establishing better systems.
I know you've had a long concern for people in your community, and you also had an opportunity in the period when Nixon and Ford were presidents and when Earl Butz was our Secretary of Agriculture. You served as the Assistant Secretary of Agriculture for Rural Development. I'd like to focus for just a moment in our discussion together on the rural communities. Again, we know there has been a significant decline economically as well as in terms of numbers of people living in rural America in the last several decades. Is there anything that you wish we had done differently as you look back?
Well, I suppose anybody who looks back always wishes you'd done this or done that and so on. If there was one particular wish, it would be that the society, that all of the people would better understand what goes on in rural communities. There was a kind of a belief that the federal government was going to do rural development. Well, the thing that's wrong with that is that it just basically builds the resistance of every little rural community who are going to do it themselves. The essence of rural America is that we can take care of ourselves and we're going to do what we want to do. It seems to me the real important thing is to let those rural communities do what they want to do, but in a very creative way, and help them in matters of education and understanding and so on. It's very common in a rural community to have one group says, we want a factory, and the next group says, we don't want a factory because we don't want to mess up the community. Well, they polarize, and they debate back and forth, and the answer to the question doesn't come from whether they do or don't want a factory. The answer to the question comes, do you want our young people to stay here or move away? Because we're not going to have jobs for them unless we have something beyond agriculture, because agriculture is going to use less and less people. Some of the people who are very much against the idea of having a factory in their community think about that a while and change their position. They come back and say, I want the young people to have a chance to stay here if they want to. And I think that's awfully important. The other thing that's important is if they do decide that they want a business or a factory or something, they very often say, that's it, we'll go get a factory. They don't say, do we have the community facilities to support it? Do we have the educational programs to support it? Do we have the environmental environment that people will want to come in? And they don't really look at the development of the community in a comprehensive basis. And then often they don't get a factory. And they say, why didn't we get it? Well, they didn't think the school system was what it ought to be, or that they didn't see that the community was enthusiastic about a creative development down the years that that new factory would be there. So it's that kind of help. Let the control stay in the hands of the people in the individual community, but give them help in how to do it creatively so that everybody's quality of life can go up. And the interesting thing is, in my 3 years in being in charge of rural development for the federal government, is you'd go to a community that had everything. It had river transportation and highways and railroads and everything, got nowhere. And then you go out someplace, a little community, that's apparently nothing, and they're going great guns. And the difference is always the leadership of that community.
You've had an exciting and illustrious career with many opportunities that I'm sure you never dreamed of when you were a young person in college. Some of the people who will listen to this interview will be college students contemplating their careers and their futures. I wonder what advice or counsel you might give to them as they consider the possibility of being involved in the process of formulating policy for our nation and world.
Well, I guess the first thing I'd suggest is that they may want to work for the government. But I think that the best way is, and of course everybody has his own best way, is to do your own profession and to think beyond that in terms of policy. I got started simply because as a young farmer who went to a lot of extension meetings and listened to a lot of policy talk by fundamentally Purdue people, I realized that the people in this community being within 50 or 100 miles of here, didn't really understand farming or agriculture and what was going on. And the result was I was asked to speak at one service club, and once you do that, they all want a free speaker. And so I was just going from service club to service club to service club, talking about what agriculture really is and what really happens. And as a result of that, I began to be asked about other things, and began to be asked then about views and policy, and began to get phone calls from Washington and asked to serve on presidential task forces for various presidents. But all my life, I've been a farmer. And I'd suggest to them that they may want to do whatever they want to. And with that, also be concerned about what happens in society and speak out on it. And then all of a sudden, by default or by normal growth process, you get involved in the policy process.
This has been an enjoyable opportunity to visit with you again, and I want to thank you for letting us into your home and onto your farm and sharing with us your wisdom and enthusiasm for policy. Thank you again.
Thank you.